I was 15 when I started to realize something was wrong at school. No one ever said anything to my face, but everyone looked, in the hallways, in the cafeteria, even inside the classroom, and it was always the same. The whispers would start and stop the second I got close. At first, I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but it wasn't, because the more time passed, the worse it got. By high school, I couldn't pretend anymore. I was being treated differently, and everyone seemed to know why, except me, until the day I found out. And when I did, I realized the problem was never something I did. It was something much bigger. Today I am 22 years old, and I can still smell that hallway. You know that particular smell of an American school? A mix of floor wax, the plastic of a new backpack, and the cheap deodorant everyone wore because they thought that was what made a person normal. I can close my eyes now, here in my apartment, with my chai going cold on the table, and go right back there, to that hallway, to that fluorescent light flickering in the third panel on the left near the water fountain that nobody ever fixed in all 4 years I spent at that school. I can go back to the exact moment when I was 15 and still understood nothing. But before I get there, I need to tell you how it started. Not the dramatic beginning, not the moment everything changed. The quiet beginning, the kind you barely notice because it is exactly the size of a doubt, small enough to fit inside your head without making noise. I remember the first day of the school year with a clarity that unsettles me a little. It was September. Summer had not quite left, and I walked through the front doors of Lakewood High with the new backpack my mother had bought at the August sales. Dark blue, with a smaller front pocket I used to keep my earphones. Simple, practical, the kind of thing I hoped would make my entrance go unnoticed. It did not. I noticed the first stairs while still in the main corridor. Not curious stares, the kind you get when someone is trying to figure out if they know you from somewhere. These were long stares, the kind that lasts 1 second more than it should, that 1 second you only notice afterwards, when you are alone in the bathroom thinking, wait, why was that girl looking at me like that? At first I ignored it, because when you are new somewhere, or when you are simply different in a way you do not yet know how to name, the first thing you learn to do is tell yourself you are exaggerating, that you are being paranoid, that people have more important things to think about than you. I was good at that. At convincing myself, it was nothing. My family came from India before I was born. My parents arrived in the United States with 2 suitcases, an English dictionary, and the absolute certainty that they were going to build something here. And they did. My father works as a software engineer to this day. My mother started a small catering business making Indian food for corporate events. The 3 of us live in a red brick house in a neighborhood that is mostly white, mostly Christian, and mostly suspicious of anything that does not fit neatly into what they expect to see. That I only understood later. At 15, I simply knew I was Indian, that my skin was darker than most of my classmates, that my mother packed different food in my tiffin, food that had a strong smell, which I, for a period far longer than I should admit, ate hidden in the bathroom because I did not want to explain what it was to anyone, that at home we spoke Gujarati mixed with English, that I had 2 names, one my family used and one I used at school because it was easier for everyone to pronounce. Priya, that was the name I used at school, a simple, short name that people could say without hesitating, but even then, even with that quiet attempt to make things easier, the stares continued. The first time I tried to talk to someone about it was with Mia. Mia had been my best friend since 7th grade. Blonde hair she hated because it was too thin, a sense of humor that made any awkward situation at least bearable, and an honesty that sometimes stung a little, but which I preferred 1,000 times over false kindness. She was the kind of person who tells you your lipstick is on your teeth before you walk into a room full of people. We were sitting at our usual table in the cafeteria when I said it. Do you think people stare at me more than they should? She looked up from her phone. She looked at me. Then she looked around the cafeteria with the expression of someone taking a situation very seriously. Yes, she said. Just that. I waited for more. She went back to her phone. Mia, Priya, does that not worry you? She sighed, put her phone down, and looked at me with that expression I already knew, the one she made when she was about to say something she thought I did not want to hear, but that needed to be said. Some people are idiots, she said. Always have been. Probably always will be. You are different to them and it bothers them because they have nothing more interesting to do than be bothered by things that have nothing to do with them. It was an honest answer. Even a good one, in its way. But it did not come close to what I was trying to understand, because what I was feeling was not just about being different. It was something more specific than that. something I could not name yet. The weeks passed and the pattern became clearer. There was something that happened every time I approached a group of people mid-conversation. The volume dropped. Not completely, but it dropped. As if someone had turned an invisible dial. And then people would look at me, give me that polite, "Hi, how are you?" smile that does not wait for an answer, and continue the conversation at a level I could no longer follow. There were also the whispers. I saw them more than I heard them, because whispers are by definition made not to be heard. But I saw the movement of lips, the tilt of heads in my direction, the moment when someone's eyes found mine and quickly looked away with a speed that only exists when someone has been caught doing something they should not. And there were the comments. These were rare, but they happened. Once in biology class, the girl who sat behind me, I will not say her name because I am past the age of holding grudges, said to the friend beside her, in a voice low but not low enough, "You know what my mom said about her." I did not hear the rest, but I heard enough to know that there was a "what my mom said about her," and that alone was enough to keep me awake for 3 nights straight. I need to be honest about something. There was a period, short but real, when I began to think that I was the problem. Not in the sense that I deserved what was happening. I did not believe that. But in the sense that I started analyzing everything I did, everything I said, the way I entered a room, the way I responded to people. I began asking myself whether I was doing something wrong, whether I had some strange habit I was not aware of, whether there was something in my personality that produced that effect on people. I spent weeks like that. Weeks trying to be quieter, gentler, more careful with my words, trying to take up less space, ask fewer questions, laugh more at jokes even when I did not find them funny. And, can you guess? The stares continued. The whispers continued. The silence whenever I approached continued. Because it was not about what I did. It was about what I was. Only I did not yet know what exactly. I only knew that there was something everyone seemed to know about me. Something circulating in the hallways, traveling from table to table in the cafeteria, passing from mother to daughter in dinner conversations in the houses of that neighborhood, and that I, the person who should have known most of all, was the last to be told. That feeling has a name, I discovered much later. It is called being the subject without having a voice in the conversation, and it is one of the most disorienting things that can happen to a person, especially when she is 15 and still trying to figure out who she is, what she wants, what it means to exist in the space she occupies. Because when you are new to yourself, and at 15 everyone is new to themselves in some way, and at the same time you realize that the people around you have already formed an opinion about you that you had no chance to influence. You lose your footing. You look around searching for a mirror that will show you what they are seeing, and you find none. The second semester of 10th grade began with snow. Not the beautiful snow of Christmas films, the kind that falls slowly and covers everything white as if the world had stopped to breathe. It was the gray snow of January, the kind that mixes with the dirt on the pavement and becomes a slush that sticks to the soles of your shoes and which you carry inside the school without meaning to. The kind of snow nobody photographs, the kind of winter people simply endure. I endured it along with everyone else, but I carried something beyond the slush on my shoes. It was during that period that I grew closer to Destiny. Destiny was new to the school. She had arrived mid-semester from Atlanta, and still carried that energy of someone still trying to understand the unwritten rules of a new place. Very short hair, large gold hoop earrings, and a way of walking through the corridors I could only describe as deliberate, as if each step were a statement that she had just as much right to be there as anyone else. I admired that about her before I even knew her name. We met in the canteen queue on a Thursday in January. She was looking at the menu board with an expression of deep and genuine suspicion, and I understood that expression completely because I had made exactly the same face in my first year. "The mac and cheese looks better than it is," I said. She looked at me, then back at the menu. "What do you recommend?" "The salad, only because it is hard to ruin lettuce." She laughed, a short, dry laugh, but real, and that is how it began. Destiny became part of my small and resilient group of friends. Me, her, and Mia. 3 people who, for completely different reasons, did not fit perfectly into the mold Lakewood High expected of its students. Mia because she was intellectually impatient with anything she considered shallow, which included most corridor conversations. Destiny because she was new, black, and from the South in an environment still working out how to deal with anything beyond its own reflection. And me because I was me, whatever that meant to those people. We had lunch together every day, studied together in the library on Wednesdays, exchanged messages late at night when someone could not sleep, It was the kind of friendship that does not need much explanation because it simply exists, solid and quiet, like a wall you only realize how much you need when you lean against it. But even inside that group, even with that safety, the questions kept going inside me. It was Destiny who first said out loud what I was feeling but could not name. We were in the library one afternoon in February, each of us pretending to study for different things, when she closed her history notebook and looked at me with that seriousness she reserved for the moments when she was about to say something important. Have you noticed that people in this school treat you like you are a secret they know and you do not? I stopped writing. We looked at each other for a second. Yes, I said. All the time. Something is going on, she said. Not as a question, as a statement. I don't know what, but something is. Mia, who was on the other side of the table, supposedly reading a chemistry book, lowered it slowly. I think so too, she said. And then the three of us sat in silence for a moment, as if the simple act of naming it out loud had given weight to something that, until then, had only been a feeling. The problem with feelings is that they have no edges. You cannot pick up a feeling, place it on a table, and examine it. You cannot say, here it is, this is the problem, now I can fix it. Feelings hang in the air like smoke. You know they are there. You feel them in your lungs, but you cannot hold them. For months, that was what I had. Smoke. I tried to build theories, tried to find the thread connecting all those stares, all those whispers, all those moments of strategic silence. I even made a list in my diary. Yes, I kept a diary, I still do. A black-covered notebook I keep in the bedside drawer, where I tried to catalog the strangest moments. The girl who said, you know what my mom said about her. The history teacher who, during a lesson on immigration, looked at me for 1 second too long when he mentioned communities that arrive and change the character of a neighborhood. The time I walked into the changing room and two girls who were talking became visibly uncomfortable and changed the subject with an unnatural speed. The birthday party of a classmate called Cassandra, to which almost everyone in the year was invited, and to which I definitely was not. When I put it all in the list, it felt more solid, more real. Less something from my own head, but it still had no edges. That same February, there was an episode that stayed with me, engraved with a precision that still unsettles me today. I was at my locker after English class, reorganizing my bag, when I heard two boys talking on the other side of the corridor. I did not know them well. They were in 11th grade, older, the kind who move in groups and rarely cross into the world of younger students except when they want something. They were talking about the neighborhood, about a specific house. I did not pay attention at first, because conversations about neighborhoods do not usually have anything to do with me. Then one of them said, it's that Indian family's house on Elm Street. I did not move. My dad talks about them sometimes, the other said. Mine too. And then they left. Just that. 23 words, perhaps fewer. But I stood in front of my open locker for a time I cannot measure, holding a literature textbook without knowing I was holding a literature textbook. My dad talks about them sometimes. Mine too. Who was them? What did the fathers say? Why? The questions came back stronger than ever, and for the first time I began to feel that the answer was not inside me. It was outside. It was in the houses of the neighborhood, at dinner tables I had never seen, in conversations between adults that happened far from school, but arrived there in the mouths of their children. There is something I have not mentioned yet, and I need to mention it now because it matters for understanding what would come next. My mother knew. Not everything, but something. I realized this one evening in March when I came home quieter than usual after a particularly heavy day at school. My mother was in the kitchen making dal, that warm smell of cumin and coriander I still associate with the feeling of arriving home, and she looked at me when I walked in and simply said, "How was it?" And when I said normal, she held my gaze for 1 second longer than necessary. Just 1 second. But I knew my mother. "Ma," I said, "is there something you have not told me about the neighborhood?" She turned back to the pot. "Eat something before you ask questions." That was not a denial. It was a postponement. And I had learned over the years that when my mother postpones a conversation rather than denies it, it is because the conversation exists, and she is still deciding how to have it. I ate. She did not bring the subject back that night, but I did not forget. March passed slowly, the way March always does. The snow left gradually, replaced by that spring mud which is different from winter mud, more hopeful somehow, as if the ground were reorganizing itself to receive something new. At school, the routine continued. Classes, group projects where I was always the last to be chosen, or the first to be ignored when the group needed to make a decision. The cafeteria with the mac and cheese that kept looking better than it was. The table of three, me, Mia, and Destiny, which was the only place I could eat without analyzing who was watching me. But something had changed. I had stopped trying to look away. I had stopped convincing myself it was my imagination, that it meant nothing, that I was being paranoid. I had accepted, not with resignation, but with a new clarity, that something real was happening, that there was a reason, that somewhere, in some conversation I had not yet had access to, there was an explanation, and I was going to find it. I did not know how, I did not know when, but I was. Part 3 of 3. The answer came from a place I did not expect. It never comes from the place you expect. I learned that. You spend months looking in one direction, building theories, trying to assemble the puzzle from the pieces you have, and then the missing piece appears from nowhere, from a completely different angle, and suddenly everything that was crooked becomes straight all at once. It was a Tuesday in April. I know it was Tuesday because we had PE on Tuesdays, and I was at my locker with my trainers when it happened. Her name was Lauren Whitfield, 12th grade, 18 years old, the kind of girl who exists in every American school almost as an archetypal character, popular without being cruel, pretty without being arrogant, part of the central group without being the absolute leader, the kind of person everyone knows but who rarely stops to really talk to anyone outside her own circle. I had barely crossed paths with her before. She found me in the corridor after PE, when everyone else had already left, and I was taking longer than I should because my shoelace had snapped during class, and I was trying to tie a knot firm enough to last until I got home. It was a completely ordinary moment. The wrong girl in the right place at the right time, or perhaps the wrong time, depending on how you look at it. Lauren walked past, stopped, looked at me, and then did something nobody in that school had done in months. She came to talk to me, properly. Not the corridor. "Hi, how are you?" That does not wait for an answer. She stopped, looked both ways as if checking whether anyone was nearby, and then said, "Can I tell you something?" I remember slowly standing up from the floor where I had been crouching over the lace. There was something in her tone that made me pay attention differently. Not the tone of someone about to share gossip, the tone of someone about to say something they know should have been said long before, someone who has been carrying that weight for too long. "Go ahead," I said. She looked both ways again. Then she looked at me. "There is something that has been going around about your family since you moved to the neighborhood. You did not start it. It is not your fault. But I think you need to know. Because everyone knows except you, and that is not fair." I said nothing. I just waited. She took a breath. "When your family bought the house on Elm Street, some residents in the neighborhood were not happy. Specifically Mr. Hargrove, who lives on the corner, and Mrs. Pellegrini, 2 houses down from you. They tried to block the sale, formally, through the Residents' Association." I still said nothing. "They did not succeed," she continued. "The law does not allow that kind of thing, obviously. But they were angry, and angry people talk. They talked to the neighbors who talked to other neighbors, and the stories grew. About your family, about you not belonging there, about the neighborhood changing. You know how these things go." I knew. I was beginning to understand that I knew, but she had not finished. "My father is friends with Mr. Hargrove," she said, and there was something in her voice I can only describe as shame. Not shame directed at me, shame at something else. I overheard conversations, many conversations, and the children in the neighborhood overheard their parents' conversations too. And when we come to school, we carry those things with us, sometimes without even realizing we are carrying them." She paused. "But I noticed," she said, and it did not seem right to keep pretending I did not know. We stood in silence for a moment. The corridor was completely empty. The fluorescent light in the third panel flickered once, as always, indifferent to everything. I tried to identify what I was feeling and could not, because there was too much at once. There was relief, that specific relief of finally understanding something that had gone without explanation for far too long, the feeling of solid ground returning after months of stepping on something unstable. There was anger, clear and warm, not the kind that makes you want to shout, but the kind that settles deep and stays. There was sadness, and there was something else that took me days to name, which I now recognize as grief. Grief for a version of the world where none of that would have needed to happen. "Thank you for telling me," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Lauren nodded. She looked as if she was going to say something more, but did not. She walked away down the corridor with the speed of someone who has just done something difficult and needs a moment to process it. I stood in the empty corridor for a time I cannot measure. That night, I went to speak to my mother. I did not ask. I told. I told her what Lauren had said, word for word, as much as I could remember. My mother listened from her chair at the kitchen table with her hands in her lap, without interrupting, without changing the expression on her face. When I finished, we sat in silence. You knew, I said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement. She waited a moment before answering. I knew part of it, she said. When we moved, we received a letter from the Residents Association. Your father spoke to a lawyer. There was nothing they could do legally, as the girl said, but we knew there was hostility. Why did you not tell me? She looked at me with that expression I associate with all the difficult decisions parents make, believing they are protecting their children. You were 12 years old when we moved, she said. What exactly would you have done with that information at 12? It was a fair question. I had no answer for it. But now I am 15, I said. Yes, she said. Now you are 15. And then she got up, went to the refrigerator, took out the dessert she had made at the weekend, kheer, rice pudding with cardamom, my favorite since I can remember, placed it in front of me and said, Eat, and then we talk as long as you want. We talked for 2 hours that night. She told me details I had not known, the full name of Mr. Hargrove, whom I discovered I had sometimes seen trimming the lawn at the corner house without ever connecting that middle-aged man with his gardening to what was happening to me at school. The Residents Association meeting, to which my parents were not invited, but of which they had learned through a kinder neighbor 3 houses up. The stares my mother received at the neighborhood supermarket, which she had learned to ignore with an efficiency that broke my heart, because it meant she had been practicing that ignoring for a long time. Ma, I said at some point, don't you get angry? She thought about the question properly before answering. My mother is like that. She does not answer before she thinks. It is one of the things I most admire about her, and one of the things that sometimes drove me mad as a child, because I wanted quick answers, and she insisted on giving true ones. I do, she said. But anger does not pay the bills, and anger does not stop me from waking up in the morning and building what I came here to build. Is that not resignation? No, she said, with a firmness that left no room for doubt. Resignation is when you accept that the world will not change. What I'm doing is strategy. I know where I place my energy. I carried that conversation to school with me in the days that followed. I observed everything with new eyes. Not new as in naive, but new as in informed. There was an enormous difference between being stared at without knowing why and being stared at knowing exactly what was behind those stares. The feeling was not good in either case. But there was something in the second version that was more bearable, because at least now I knew the problem was not mine. It never had been. I told Mia and Destiny at our usual table in the cafeteria. Mia was silent for a moment and then said, with that objectivity of hers, so that was it. I knew it was something concrete. Destiny said nothing for a longer time. When she spoke, she said only, "Welcome to the club," in a tone that was neither ironic nor bitter, but which carried inside it an entire story I knew she had, but did not yet know fully. Being welcome to a club nobody wanted to belong to, but being in it with the right people. In those days, I began to notice something. I began to notice there was a difference between the people who looked at me with that inherited strangeness, the kind that came from dinner table conversations they had absorbed without questioning, and the people who looked at me with genuine curiosity but did not know how to approach. They were two completely different kinds of look, and for months I had grouped them both into the same category because on the surface they appeared the same. Now I could tell them apart, and I began carefully to respond in different ways to each. For the first kind, silence. Not the defensive silence of before, but a chosen silence, deliberate, that said, I know what is happening here, and I will not make myself smaller because of it. For the second kind, openness. Small, measured, but real. There is something nobody tells you about discovering a truth you have spent months searching for. You imagine that when it arrives, it will resolve everything, that it will be like turning on a light in a dark room. Suddenly you can see where the furniture is, you stop walking into corners, you move with confidence. And in a way, it is like that. But what nobody mentions is that turning on the light also means seeing the mess that was in the dark all along, and then you have to decide what to do with it. I was 15 years old with a room full of mess. The weeks after the conversation with Lauren were strange in a way I had not expected. On one hand, there was that relief I already mentioned. Solid ground returning, the confirmation that my perception had been right all along, and that I was neither paranoid nor exaggerating. On the other hand, there was something new without an easy name, a different awareness. as if I had spent months walking through school half asleep, reacting to things without fully understanding them, and now I was suddenly awake in an environment that had not changed at all, but which I saw with an uncomfortable sharpness. Every stare had context now. Every silence had an origin. That did not make things easier. It made them more real. There was one specific moment, about 2 weeks later, that stayed with me with a clarity that still surprises me when I think about it. It was a Friday, end of the day, and I was walking through the main corridor towards the exit when I crossed paths with Mr. Patterson, the American history teacher. He was a man of about 50, gray hair, the kind of teacher who clearly loved the subject he taught, but sometimes forgot that students also needed to be present in the conversation, not just listening. He saw me, greeted me with a nod, and then, I do not know if it was impulsive, I do not know if he thought before he spoke, said, "Priya, have you ever considered sharing a bit of your culture with the class? We have that diversity project next month." I stopped. I looked at him, and I felt two things simultaneously, with a clarity that only exists when you are truly awake to what is happening around you. The first, he was being genuine. There was no malice in that question. He was a well-intentioned teacher trying to do something he believed was inclusive. The second, there was something deeply exhausting about being called to exist inside a classroom, primarily as a representative of a culture, as if my value in that space depended on my willingness to be educational for everyone else, as if I were a teaching resource with a dark blue backpack. "I will think about it," I said, and I left, not with anger, with a new understanding of the many different ways a person can be seen without truly being recognized. I told Destiny about the episode that afternoon. She listened to everything, and then said, with that economy of words that was her trademark, "The exhaustion of having to be the ambassador of your own existence. I know it well." It was the most precise definition I had ever heard for something I had been feeling, but could not articulate. The exhaustion of having to be the ambassador of your own existence. I wrote it in my diary that night. It is still there, in that black-covered notebook, in the hurried handwriting of a 15-year-old girl who is learning things nobody should have to learn so early, but which life insists on teaching regardless. Mr. Patterson's diversity project happened in May. I decided to participate, not because he had asked, not to please anyone, not to prove anything to the people who stared at me in the corridors. I decided to participate because when I sat looking at the sign-up form for about 10 minutes one Wednesday afternoon, I realized that the only reason I was hesitating was the fear of being reduced to a traditional outfit, to a food recipe, to an informational leaflet about a country I had never even visited, because I was born here, in the United States, in a hospital in Ohio, the daughter of two people who chose this country before I existed. And then I realized that if I let that fear stop me, I was letting the people who stared at me define what I could or could not do in my own space. So I did the project. But I did it my way. I did not present a traditional outfit. I did not bring food, though my mother had offered to make enough samosas to feed the entire class, which I registered as an absurdly large act of love on her part and declined with the same amount of affection. I made a presentation about hybrid identity, about what it means to grow up between two worlds without fully belonging to either, and why that is not a tragedy. Because it is not a tragedy, I had learned. It is a specific way of seeing the world that most people do not have access to. You learn to translate, not just languages, but ways of thinking, ways of being, ways of understanding why people do what they do. I spoke about the Gujarati I speak at home mixed with the English I speak at school, and about how my mind operates in both simultaneously, not as confusion, but as a specific ability to navigate different contexts. I spoke about having two names and about what each of them carries. I spoke briefly and carefully about knowing that there were people in the neighborhood who would have preferred my family not to be there, not with bitterness, with honesty. I said that this information had cost me months of confusion, and that I thought people should know that the conversations adults have at home arrive at school in the mouths of their children, and that those conversations carry real weight in the real lives of real people. The room went silent when I said that. Not the silence of when I approached a group and voices dropped, a different silence. The kind that happens when something true has been said in a space not accustomed to hearing that kind of truth. After the presentation, Lauren Whitfield waited for me at the classroom door. She did not say much. She said, "That was brave," in a quiet voice, and then left. But there was something in that brevity that was more meaningful than any long speech would have been. Mia stayed by my side through the entire next break, saying almost nothing, which was her way of saying she was proud. Destiny sent me a message that night, which read only, "You said what a lot of people will never have the courage to say. That counts." I kept that message. I still have it somewhere on an old phone that no longer works, but which I cannot bring myself to throw away. I will not romanticize the ending. Things did not change completely after that. Mr. Hargrove kept trimming his lawn with that closed expression. Some people kept looking at me with that inherited strangeness I learned to recognize but never completely ignore. The corridor at Lakewood High kept its flickering light in the third panel that nobody ever fixed. But something had changed in me, and that mattered more than any change that could or could not happen around me. I learned that year that there is a fundamental difference between being seen and being recognized. Being seen is passive. It happens to you. People saw my skin, saw my surname on the register, saw the different tiffin, saw what the parents had said about the family on Elm Street, and built a version of me from those pieces without ever asking me anything. Being recognized is something else. It requires participation from both sides. It requires someone to decide to look beyond the first layer, and it also requires you to decide to show yourself, not as an ambassador, not as a representative of anything, but as a specific person, with your own name, your own story, your own contradictions. Few people made that effort in those years. Mia, Destiny, Lauren, in that empty corridor on a Tuesday. My mother, in the kitchen smelling of cumin, telling me things she had kept for a long time thinking she was protecting me. It was enough, not the number I would have wanted, but enough to get me here. Today I am 22 years old. I am sitting in my apartment. The chai that forgot to cool down has been reheated and forgotten to cool down again. And I am looking out of the window at a street that is not Elm Street, and is not the corridor of Lakewood High, and has nothing to do with flickering fluorescent lights. Sometimes I think about the 15-year-old girl who stood frozen in front of her open locker holding a literature textbook without knowing she was holding a literature textbook, processing 23 words overheard by chance in a corridor. And I feel for her a tenderness that is not pity, because she does not deserve pity. She deserved more explanations and less silence, but not pity. It is a tenderness that comes from knowing what she did not yet know, that the answers would come, that she would manage to name things, that the ground would become solid again, that she would grow with all of it inside her, not as an open wound but as understanding. I still carry both names, the one my family uses and the one I used at school, but I no longer see them as a division. I see them as two angles of the same point, two ways of being the same person in different contexts, which is not weakness or fragmentation. It is simply being someone who learned early to translate. And translators, I learned, see things that those who only know one language cannot. If I could go back to that corridor, to the flickering light, to the smell of floor wax and new backpack plastic, to the 15-year-old girl who still understood nothing, I would not change what happened. Not because it was good. It was not. But because everything that happened taught me something I could not have learned any other way. I learned that silence can be a weight other people place on you without permission, and that naming things out loud is an act of resistance. I learned that the people who stay by your side when stories about you are told without you are the people worth every second of attention you give them. I learned that your mother sometimes knows more than she lets on because she is trying to protect you, and that there comes a moment when that protection becomes a cost no longer worth paying. And that moment, when it finally arrives, opens a conversation that should have happened sooner, but which still arrives at the right time. And I learned, above all, that discovering the reason why people look at you strangely is not the end of anything. It is only the beginning of you deciding what to do with that information. Priya, that is my name, both of them. And I occupy the space I occupy without asking permission from anyone.